A very good evening, Zimbabwe. You are listening to Studio 7 from the Voice of America on Wednesday, June the 3rd, 2015. And this is Live Talk. I'm Blessing Zulu.
And I'm Kip Stube.
And tonight on Studio 7 Live Talk, we are talking about the future of US-Zimbabwe relations.
To join the discussion, phone us directly at this number, 001-202-619-2077, and we'll call you back.
And as usual, Live Talk goes out to Zimbabwe on our 909 medium wave frequency and on the 4930, 5940 and 15460 kilohertz shortwave, Monday through Friday at 8:30 p.m.
On the internet, you can find us at www.voazimbabwe.com, www.voashona.com, and www.voindebele.com.
Once again, thanks for joining us. You are listening to Studio 7 Live Talk. And tonight on Live Talk, we are talking about the future of US-Zimbabwe relations.
The U.S. Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, Global Human Rights and International Organizations is currently in session discussing the future of U.S.-Zimbabwe relations. Panelists testifying at the hearing are Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Africa, Shannon Smith, Executive Director Ben Frith of the Michael Campbell Foundation, and Regional Program Director for Africa, Imani Countess of the Solidarity Center.
Chairman of the subcommittee, Christopher Smith, said on the hearing, and I quote, "The United States has experienced a troubled relationship with the Southern African nation of Zimbabwe from its founding in 1980 until today. President Robert Mugabe has ruled through repressive tactics since he rose to power. This hearing will examine current U.S. policy and look ahead to what the post-Mugabe landscape might look like."
What are your views on this issue? If you wish to join us right now, phone us directly at this number, 001-202-619-2077, and we'll call you back. That number again, 001-202-619-2077. Those that are using Skype, they can, who are using WhatsApp, they can send us a message right now on WhatsApp. Our number is 1-202-465-0318. Ye ngakunjalo mfowethu.
Onguka amadzadiwa nasi toda kuti tinge tichitarisa nezvekudyidzana kuripo pakati peZimbabwe neAmerica. Tinoziva kuti America yakatemera vamwe vakuru vehurumende zvirango vachitiwo vari kutyora kodzero dzevanhu, asi nekune rimwe rutivi hurumende inoti America inenge iri kupindira pahondo yayo neBritain, ichitiyo Britain haina kufara pakatorwa minda yanga ine varimi vachena ichipiwa vanhu vatema. Asi nhasi chiri kuitika ndechekuti pane komiti yemuno muAmerica inoona nezvekodzero dzevanhu iri kuzeya remangwana reZimbabwe neAmerica munyaya dzezvekudyidzana. Gibbs.
Yebombe zulukandaba lingalitshola njani thina ngapha lo Blessing hayi sisadonsa kancane esikhuluma ngakho ke namhlanje sibona khonokho okwenzakala ngapha eMelika endaweni ke okuthiwa iCapitol Hill. Siyakwazi lapho ke okuhlangana khona abantu abakudale leCongress lapho abakhuluma khona ngobudlelwano beZimbabwe le-United States. Esikwaziyo nje Khathesi Blessing ukuthi kulama sanctions kumbe ngithi izijezo zenotho ezafakelwa umongameli Robert Mugabe labanye bakhe besetheswa icala lokuthi kungana bahambisi kuhle ukhetho kwele Zimbabwe njalo lokunye okuhluphayo. Okuza kukhangelwa kakhulu ukuthi kambe kungenziwani ukuthi kumbe kucina kube lobudlelwano obungcono kumbe kuyahlala kunjalo. Sifuna ukuzwa ngani zulukandaba ukuthi kambe lali kubona njani khonokho. Silabo abafowethu abakhona ngale Congress. Siloke uNtukameli Nkomo kuzobuya ke uJonga Kanimiri bakhona ngale bakhangela ukuthi kuhamba njani eCongress. Sikhuluma kunje.
Of course, the meeting is about to start the congressional hearing, and of course we'll hear from our reporters who are at that particular hearing. And I think Gibbs, we have our first guest so far, that is human rights lawyer Dewa Mavinga. Mr. Mavinga, good evening. we are having a problem connecting with Mr. Mavinga, but I think we have Mr. David Monyae, an independent political analyst based in South Africa. Mr. Monyae, good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you so much for joining us.
You're most welcome.
Gibbs, maybe you can start the ball rolling.
Mr. Munyaye, what do you think about the discussion that is going on today, right now at the Congress in USA? They are discussing this kind of U.S.-Zimbabwe relations. What do you think about that kind of deliberations?
I think it's something way overdue. I think there are a number of issues just to reflect back a bit. When President Obama came into power way back, one of the major trips to Ghana as well as Egypt, the speeches that he made, he emphasized one thing and one thing that we should all remember. He said he is going to reconsider those leaders who will change and bring democratic or move toward democratic path. I think it is within that context that regardless of problems in Zimbabwe, whether economic or political, things are not as perfect as they should, but there has been registered positive movement in a limited way. The elections were held, and there has been a gradual relaxation in terms of certain tough laws and changes here and there, which move towards democracy. And therefore, I think it is in the same token, in the same way that the U.S. has to respond, gradually moving away from your hard stand sanction, in line with what the European Union is doing in terms of relaxing sanctions. So I think I see the discussions starting that kind of conversation.
But it appears there is pressure on the European Union actually to reconsider that position, because human rights groups in Zimbabwe are saying the situation is actually deteriorating. We have a human rights activist, Itai Dzamara, who was abducted on March 9. Nothing is, no one has heard from him since then. And there are by-elections, and there are reports of violence and other complaints. The Constitution, though the people voted for the Constitution, nothing has been done to align the laws with the Constitution.
I think pressure should be exerted, but let's face it. As much as the Cuba move, the U.S. is aware that you can't stick to one policy that is not bringing positive results. The bigger question I have for the very same human rights people is that for how long should the U.S. or any other Western country pursue a policy that is not bringing any positive results? I think that is a question that they need to deal with. There is a need to use other instruments, to use other way of registering or achieving the same strategic objectives of attaining democracy in Zimbabwe. And the movements, the policies of the past decades haven't been working in our view. So that's one point. My second point, it has to do with the very same that you can't really go on punishing the entire nation based on one man, an old man. I think one has to move from that. I think you need to have certain milestones to say at this stage, certain stages, certain phases have been reached, and therefore let's reduce sanctions to this level. And if you meet the next level, you change the law as you put it, then we relax the next. Something must happen. We can't stay with the same story that is not taking the people of Zimbabwe and the continent forward. And finally, it is also in the U.S. interest to do that. U.S. cannot live on democracy alone. It's a country that is also battling with issues with interest, economy, and there's a lot of competition. There are other players that are moving, and have much more influence than the U.S. So for it to maintain its influence in Zimbabwe, it ought to do what it is doing as we speak.
Thank you so much, Mr. Monyae. Interesting argument there. And for those of you who are just joining us, this is Studio 7 Live Talk. And tonight on Live Talk, we are talking about the future of U.S.-Zimbabwe relations. And our first guest is Mr. David Monyae. Tomboenda ku Congress kune mutoredi wenhau Jonga Kandebiri. Jonga, wakadi? Jonga? Uri kundinzwa here Jonga? Jonga, ungatudza kuti zvinhu zvakamira sei vanhu vatanga here kuzeya nenyaya yekudyidzana kweZimbabwe neAmerica?
Aiwa, vanhu havasati vatanga kuzeya nyaya izvi, vanhu vaungana vauya vakawanda vari kuda kuteerera pamwe nekupawo pfungwa dzavo pamusoro penyaya yekuda kukurukurwa. Chikuru chekutaurira pamaita vateereri nevari kuona inyaya yekuti nyaya yekuda kukurukurwa pano ndeyekukama hweZimbabwe neAmerica pane ranhasi, zuva ranhasi uye ramangwana. Zimbabwe yakanga isina mutungamiri vaRobert Mugabe. Vanenge vachitarisa kuti ukama hunenge hwakaita sei, asi havasati vazivikanwa kuti vanenge vachitarisira ukama kubva kune vemapato vezvematongerwo enyika anosvikisa hurumende yavaMugabe here kana kuti bato ravaMugabe rinenge riro riri kuenderera mberi nekutonga asi vaMugabe vachisekumasimba.
Pane vamwe here vauya vamakwanisa kunge muchimbotaura navo kana kuti muchiri makangomira?
Tambozeyawo zvino nevamwe vatiinavo vetine chitsvaro cheZimbabwe munhare yezvisachiwayo vari pano. Tambozeyawo navo vachitaurawo kuti aiwa zvinotarisira kuti ukuru chaitwa pano tichasunungura zvinhu mamiriro akaita nyaya dzezvematongerwo enyika kuZimbabwe, nekuti dzimwe nguva kutambura kuri kuitwa nevana veZimbabwe kunogona kuti uchireruswa kubva muhurukuro dzakadai. Chinhu chakanaka zvikuru kuti paitwe hurukuro dzakadai.
Ko pane vamwewo here vabva kumuzinda weZimbabwe vauya apa?
Hongu kwauya muteereri wemumiriri weZimbabwe muno muAmerica, vatingati deputy ambassador vachibuwe, pamwe chete nevanoonawo nezvekukwidzana kweZimbabwe nevamwe vari muno vamaspika vatingati consula vari muno zvakare. Ndaonawo zvakare vaBen Frith varimo, mumwe wevanhu vari kutarisirwa kukurukura pamusangano iwoyu kana kuti pahurukuro iyoyi. Ndinoimba vazhinji vanoziva vaFrith semurimi wechichena anove mumwe wevanhu vanoti vakatorerwa minda yavo nehurumende yeZimbabwe vari kugunun'una. Ndaonawo zvakare Profesa Stanford Mukasa vasvikawo asi handisati ndaona hangu mukana wekukurukura navo. Ndinotarisira kuti ndichakurukura navo tichizwawo maonero avo nemafambiro anenge aita musangano.
Aiwa, tinotenda zvikuru Jonga.
Aiwa, tinotenda zvikuru Blessing, ticharamba tichikupai zvekuita kuno.
Aiwa, tinotenda zvikuru hongu Gibbs kutaura kuri kuita Jonga ari kuCongress uko. Musangano wacho unenge wati nonokei kutanga, wanga wachifanira kuti unge uchitanga iwo na2 wopera na5 asi vanenge vati nonokei zvavo kuti unge uchitanga. And for the benefit of our guests and also our listeners and viewers, I think what our reporter there at the Congress is saying is there has been a delay. The meeting was supposed to start at 2 and end at around 5. But the meeting, of course, is yet to start. But he is saying that many people turned up for this hearing. So we'll hear from our reporter, Jonga Kandemiri, later on when the meeting starts. And interestingly, he is saying Zimbabwe's deputy ambassador to the United States of America is also present at this hearing. So are other senior officials from Zimbabwe's embassy in America. Gibbs.
I'm told, Blessing, that we are now connected to Mr. Tewa Mavinga, who is a human rights activist, or let me say lawyer, and is based in, is it Johannesburg?
Now, he is in London at the moment.
In London.
Yes.
Mr. Mavinga, good evening and welcome to the program.
Evening, my brother Gibbs. How are you? And Blessing, how are you in DC?
We are very fine, our brother. So now we've got Mr. David Monyae here, who is actually saying that, the United States cannot live on democracy alone. there are certain issues that it has to look at as well, when it, looks at Zimbabwe. So one of the issues he says, this hard stance on Zimbabwe concerning sanctions may be missing the point. What is your view on that?
Well, my view is that the U.S. Foreign policy towards Zimbabwe, which is broadly action for action, which is that really it is up to primarily the government of Zimbabwe to reach out, to re-engage, to reset relations with the international community, including the European Union and the U.S. government. In this regard, the government of Zimbabwe must consider all aspects that would lead to a normalization of relations on its part. And therefore, on my part, I think it is misplaced to try and seek action on the part of America only without looking at what Zimbabwe has to do on its own. And in fact, I would want to go further and say, for Zimbabwe, it should really not be about the international community exerting pressure by way of sanctions or other things for the country of Zimbabwe to respect its own fundamental values and principles that are reflected in our 2013 Constitution, to respect the rights of citizens. This is precisely what the Liberation War in the 60s and 70s was about in Zimbabwe. It was about independence. It was about freedom. It was about Zimbabweans as a nation being free to be what they can be, to flourish in their own country, and to be free from persecution and oppression. At the time in 1980, people were talking of a racist minority colonial regime. But now there is that kind of oppression which continues. So for international relations to be reset, Zimbabwe must embrace truly and in totality the true essence of the liberation struggle and the true essence of the values, the letter and spirit of our Constitution.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mavinga. Gibbs.
Let's go back to Mr. Mohaye. I think we are trying to get hold of Mr. Tukwamile Nkomo, but we're not getting through. Now, let's get back to you, Mr. Mohaye. Mr. Mavinga is talking about the essence of, the liberation struggle. And he's saying those tenets of the liberation struggle are not being followed. So unless and until that is done, nothing should be done towards Zimbabwe by the United States and its partners. What do you think about that?
Oh, well, I don't think anyone would argue with what my good colleague has mentioned. I think he has made quite good points, but I think it is ZANU-PF government that should and must relook into the norms and values that underpin its own liberation and really ask hard questions. Why is the country, why are they faced with this kind of situation? Something terrible has happened within ZANU-PF itself. And therefore, that kind of renewal ought to start within ZANU-PF and the country and ensure that at the heart of it is the respect for human rights and development of Zimbabweans to avoid massive movement of people and really bring development, a wish that the AU, that President Mugabe is chairing, and SADC really are looking at. You have to have that infrastructure development, kickstart the agriculture sector, and ensure that you increase volume trade among African countries and stability. So there is absolutely no doubt. We need to separate two things, though. I think the major point that I was making is that we need to move away from the view that democracy or United States is doing Zimbabweans a favor. It has to just press sanctions and things will happen. Yes, United States is pro-democracy and no one will doubt that. But United States also has interest. I think that's my point. United States has interest. And after 5-10 years, it reevaluates its policy towards any country and change gear. So I'm not surprised that this hearing are not just about democracy, they are also about U.S. interest towards its own interest in Zimbabwe and how best to secure those interests. It has to engage the Zimbabwe government, and that is a great move, as well as continue engaging the civil society and opposition parties. And that's a normal thing that happens within international relations.
Thank you so much, Mr. Monyai. I think we now have our other reporter, Ntunga Milinkomo, at the Congress. Gibbs.
Yeah, sike sizwe ke si ukhona necingwane khonapho Ntungameli Nkomo. Uyasizwe ecingweni baba Ntungameli Nkomo? Yeah, kunjani khonapho eCongress akusitshele ngoba kula khona okwenziwayo namhlanje ungathini? Ukhulumele phezulu kancane ba.
Hayi kuhamba kuhle ngapha bajoyina abantu beCongress lapha bamelele ubaba Msimithi udokotela Jana Msimithi onguye wakhokhela iqula leZimbabwe kumaviki amathathu edluleyo. Ubesabambelele ngokunye kodwa ngithola umbiko ukubana uyeza kathesi nje kumzuzwana embala elandelayo singaba sibhalisa lapha. Bakhona abantu abaningi abavela eZimbabwe ngibone iziphathamandla ze-embassy.
Yebo kwezilizwi kancane baba Nkomo. Yasikuzwa kuhle kwezilizwi kancane.
Kusho ukuthi i-connection idube kodwa ilizwi lami liphezulu kakhulu.
Sesikuzwa kakhulu ye.
Bakhona abantu abaningi lapha abavela eZimbabwe. Ukhona uBen Free umlimi ongumunye wabazakhuluma. Bakhona abavela e-embassy, bakhona nabantu izizalwane zeZimbabwe ezinamalunga azimeleyo ezimelele ukuthi ubudlelwano phakathi kweMelika sokungahamba njani-ke ngaphezulu. Kodwa abantu abaningi abakhangelelanga ukubana kube nemikhuba.
Ye kodwa nxa usizwa amahemhem khonapho bathi kungaguqulwani ngokuzwa kwakho? Sikhuluma lengcwele sikhuluma nabantu abalapha, of course ngabala esingathi i-official narrative, kodwa bathi kababona ukubana kungaba lenguquko ngoba eHarare akukabi lenguquko ekhona njengokusho kukaSmith evela eZimbabwe. Uzakhumbula ukubana uke wakhuluma lo-Blessing Zulu kumala namba lasanda kwethuna. Wathi sikubonileyo siseHarare ngale akuthabisi ikakhuluma sikhangela kwezombusazwe sikhangela kwendaba zamalungelo oluntu. Ngalokho kulutshwana esingathi okupositive abantu abalapha bakukhangelela. Ye ngicela ukugcizelele ngesilungu nje khonokho nje kancane 1 minute usitshele ke ngesilungu ukuthi ngani kuyaphumani khonapho.
People here are not very optimistic about any positive outcome in terms of Washington shifting its bilateral relations with Zimbabwe because, as you know, Dr. John Smith had an interview with President Zulu, our own President Zulu, a couple of days ago when he came back from his trip in Zimbabwe. And basically his message was that, Zimbabwe has not moved positively in terms of human rights, in terms of restoring the rule of law. So really there is a much positivity that people here are expecting from this congressional hearing.
Thank you very much, Ntungameli Nkomo. We hope to get back to you as soon as possible. Otherwise, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Thank you. Blessing.
Of course, just to correct him there, the interview was with Dr. Shannon Smith. She. Yes, after a visit to Zimbabwe. But let me come to you, Mr. Mavinga. Mr. Mavinga, Mr. Monyai raised an interesting point about the embargo on Cuba that was passed in 1960 that has been lifted. So he's saying, can we not use the same model when it comes to Zimbabwe? I don't think much has actually changed in Cuba.
Well, I think it is not quite within all, forced to compare Zimbabwe to the case of Cuba. But having said that, yes, that could be a template. But if you look at the number of years that it took for the relationship with Cuba to be reset, and if we are to take the same template of Cuba, there has been some kind of power transfer and regime change that was now focusing on reforms that have been taking place under the leadership of Fidel Castro's brother. So for Zimbabwe as well, there is need for this kind of reform and renewal, as my colleague has said, within ZANU-PF, which seriously looks at the issue of President Mugabe's succession, because it has the potential to torpedo the country into chaos and anarchy, especially if you look at the way in which there have been these fights within ZANU-PF and factionalism and expulsions, and even as we speak, that has not been resolved. And the involvement of the security forces, who have a long history in Zimbabwe of being highly partisan and extremely politicized in favor of ZANU-PF, that is a recipe for disaster, where you have unclear succession plans and policies and a highly partisan leadership of the security forces. And this is what the international community is looking at. And, people are saying, and people like you and myself in the diaspora, people have voted with their feet, they have left Zimbabwe. And if you are to ask them today, have there been reforms sufficient to motivate you to return to Zimbabwe? Many would still say no. Even those that are suffering under xenophobic waves of violence in South Africa, they are still not prepared to be repatriated back to Zimbabwe. Why? Because Zimbabwe has not taken steps forward to demonstrate reform, to demonstrate human rights respect. And now you have people like the Vice President, Emerson Mnangagwa, saying that we will not reform or we will not have electoral reforms if the MDC so wishes. They will continue to boycott and demand reforms, but we will continue to rule. So there hasn't been that kind of shift. If you like, you could say the ZANU-PF leopard has not changed its spots. And therefore, to expect, the international community to change, the dance when ZANU-PF has not changed the music is quite difficult. This is why you would say that perhaps the EU and others have been too optimistic about the hope that the ZANU-PF leopard is about to change its spots when there is no such thing on the ground. Activists like Itai Zamara today are still missing under unclear circumstances, and the police, in a very partisan and brazenly political way, is not taking action. You have electoral violence in Urungwe West. Temba Mlifwa was just today released from custody on spurious politically motivated charges. This shows that, ZANU-PF has not changed its ways. So to expect that the discussion today in the U.S. would have any other outcome than that which we already know that hasn't been changed to justify or to motivate, a shift on the part of the U.S. policy would be to be politically naive.
Mm-hmm. Okay, hold Mr. Mavinga, gaititorium terere do kutanga mkoma Andrew makadi. Aiwa tiripo tipewo pfungwa dzenyu mkoma Andrew moti gaga.
Ndinoona sokuti zviri nani kuti tinowirirana neUnited States neZimbabwe.
Alright, mkoma Andrew, rambai makabata tiri kudzoka kwamuri timbotora ka break mchana. Mr. Mavinga and Mr. Monyai, please do stay on the line. We'll be back in a bit. For our radio listeners, we are streaming live. So go to www.voazimbabwe.com and press on Live Talk. This is Blessing Zulu.
And I'm Gibbs Dube saying stay tuned.
okay, tisati tadzokera kuna mukoma Andrew. Mukoma Andrew, ndoda kuti mumborambe makadaro. Mr. Monyaye, we understand you have a prior engagement. Maybe your last word.
Is that I think the discussions will initiate or start a positive move in relaxing sanctions. And I think the major for all listeners is that democracy does not only come out of sanctions. At times, you have to have good relation, more trade, and encourage more people to claim their rights, and you get democracy through that. It's not only sanction that brings democracy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Monyaye, for your time, and have a blessed evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Regai tidzokere kuna mukoma Andrew. Mukoma Andrew, muchiti zvakakosha kuti Zimbabwe idyidzane neAmerica. Tsanangurai tinzwe.
Ndiona sekuti zviri nani kuti tidyidzane neAmerica nekuti iye zvinezvi zvimwe munyika zvinotova nani nepamusana pe-strength yedhola ratiri kushandisa. Zvekuti deta tisingashandisi American dollar hamina kuti zvinhu zvingadai zvasvika papi parizini ndikutaura parizini yezvinezvi. Yeah. Saka zviri nani kuti hamene masanctions aripo zvawo asi zvanga ma-excuses atinozopuwa negovernment kana yakufeila, it's always there are sanctions kana kuti we haven't got foreign currency. That is kana takusenzesa mazini dollars. Saka pari zvinhu zvinotoba nani kana tishandisa mazini maningirikiri ma-American dollars. And tinofanira kuti tive nema-relations, tibuilde ma-relations nema-Americans tiwirirana zvakanaka. Ndopfungwa dzangu.
Aiwa, tinotenda zvikuru mukoma Andrew. Of course, Andrew is saying it is important for Zimbabwe to try and normalize relations with America, and is not very convinced by some of the excuses given by the government for failure, for example, to revive the economy, such as that is sanctions are to blame for almost everything, that happens in Zimbabwe. Gibbs.
So we'll take a 2-second break and so I think we've got a message from Nikros Kajengo instead of taking that break, right? So Kajengo says, thank you. Nice topic for discussion today. I'm just advising and urging all those who will be lucky to be called for this debate to speak and express themselves clearly without fear, favor, or prejudice. Emotions, bootlicking, and unnecessary attack. No. Let's bring out facts that will help the two countries. The stance being taken by the United States to include us on the agenda for negotiations is a welcome move. America should understand and respect our position as Zimbabwe, and on the other hand, us as Zimbabweans, let's agree to engage all countries globally if we are to succeed in our national plans and targets as enshrined in Zim Asset. Being controversial and argumentative is not the answer. If there are any areas of weakness that requires correction, and it's high time that we should walk the talk. We are in a global village. Let's not put barriers or demarcations, to being partners with the USA. So I think he's got a point there, right?
Of course, for those of you who are just joining us, good evening. And this is Studio 7 Live Talk. And of course, what's on your screen there is what is streaming live from this congressional hearing on Zimbabwe, the subcommittee on human rights that is actually meeting to discuss Zimbabwe. And on the floor right now is Dr. Shannon Smith, Deputy Secretary, U.S. Deputy Secretary Assistant for African Affairs, and of course the speakers that we have, we have Mr. Frith, right, who is also part of the discussion, and Ms. Contes, you spoke to her.
That's right. Imani Countess was talking about, maybe some more engagements of this nature are going to help. And we are told that, as per what Ntungameni Komo and Jonga Kandemiro is saying, the deputy U.S. ambassador, from Zimbabwe is around. He's actually attending that kind of hearing. So there's also the consular, the person who is in the U.S. embassy here. Mr. Matsika is also attending. And as you have said, there's Ben Frith and Professor Stanford Mukasa. I think is very interesting, right?
And of course kutombotarisa ku WhatsApp kuti kune mukoma Donald vatiwo vamugabe gawambosira mumwe pamwe anouya nepfungwa kwadzo ivo vombozororawo then pane mwari kuti ndini baba ashi pajonapo anoti but kutaura chokwadi masanctions aya atikuvadza auraya isusu vanhuwo zvavo tiri kungotambura kuno kuSouth Africa mugabe nemhuri yake vari kuguta. And I think we have our third guest rather that is Dr. Nkululeko Sibanda.
No, it's Mr. Sabelo Sibanda.
Sabelo Sibanda.
Yes.
Okay.
A Pan-Africanist and member of Community Initiative.
Yes.
Upondo. Yes. Upondo.
Upondo.
Yes.
Okay.
Upondo is a horn.
Yes. Mr. Sibanda, good evening.
Good evening, sir. How are you doing?
We are doing great, and thanks for joining us.
Not a problem. It's a pleasure.
Now, what is your take on this hearing that is taking place here, on Zimbabwe-U.S. relations? We've got a very high-powered delegation that is in terms of the U.S. government, and we've got some representatives from the Zimbabwe embassy based in Washington. What do you think could be the outcome of this kind of hearing?
Well, the likelihood is that there will be something positive that will come out of it. This is based on the fact that the past, if it's anything to go by, would tell us that the relationship has been very, very hostile as between the two countries, with lines drawn and with very little in as far as desire to compromise. For instance, if you look at it from the perspective that there was an attempt in 2010, I think it was Senator James Inhofe, a Republican from Oklahoma, who tried to introduce a motion for the repeal of the Zimbabwe sanctions bill, basically. And a vote was never taken. And in October 2011, the same motion was raised to be able to reopen that debate. But from the American perspective, there was no willingness to shift in as far as revisiting the relationship with Zimbabwe and the position as regards sanctions affecting Zimbabwe. And at the same time, on the Zimbabwean side, there has been a very hostile sort of position as regards the relationships with the United States, more particularly informed by Zidera, which has had a massive impact on Zimbabwe in many different ways. But of interest now, particularly with the current discussion going on in Congress, the question that necessarily arises is who is really pushing it and who stands to benefit the most out of this kind of relationship. I think, yes, it's important for such discussions to be had, but at the same time, it's also important to ensure that they don't leave the ordinary Zimbabwean more compromised than already is the situation. Yeah.
Thank you very much, and stay on the line. Blessing?
No problem, my friend.
I think we have our fourth guest, that's Mr. Nick Mangwana, ZANU-PF UK Province Chairperson. Mr. Mangwana, good evening.
Good evening.
Of course, tonight, Mr. Mangwana, we are talking about U.S.-Zimbabwe relations. the European Union, of course, as you know, by now is eased sanctions, and I think the only persons remaining President Robert Mugabe and the First Lady, Grace Mugabe, but they are trying to normalize ties. But the U.S., it's a different story. What is your take on the relationship between Washington and Harare?
It still remains, the relationship remains frosty at the moment. It's definitely, even though the bilateral dispute between Zimbabwe and Great Britain is the one that was franchised to Europe and America. America seems to now hold a different stance from Great Britain and the rest of Europe.
And, of course, I had the opportunity to talk to Dr. Shannon, one of the senior officials in the Obama administration, and I asked her about the impact of sanctions, and she said it is exaggerated by Harare because she pointed at the World Bank report, which says it's actually very difficult to do business with Harare, and she said the sanctions are targeted. Your response, Mr. Mangwana?
That's, for want of a better word, I would say that's nonsense. Because in the first place, when these sanctions were instituted against the individuals and corporate bodies that they were instituted against, you would find that not much money was impounded. In fact, no money was literally impounded from individuals. So why escalate the sanctions if they are not effective? Because those individuals have no money. Clearly, nobody is sending money out of the country. So that's one. Two, we know of corporations that cannot trade with Zimbabwe. We know of corporations that cannot be sent to Zimbabwe because of that. So it does affect. If it affects our corporates, if it affects our corporations, it affects our employment. If it affects our employment, it affects our ordinary people. If it affects ordinary people, it sends vendors on the street. So the sanctions are effective. If they were not effective at all, just repeal them then. Because in the first place, if you look at the way the acronym is there, actually the ER means economic recovery. But we are not seeing anything that's going to the economic recovery of Zimbabwe. All we are seeing is the decimation of the Zimbabwean economy. So definitely, their position is not really compatible with economic recovery at all.
Gibbs.
I was about to actually quote exactly what Zitera says about what Mr. Mangwana is actually alluding to. Now, one of the primary objectives of the Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act is, quote, to support the people of Zimbabwe in their struggle to effect peaceful democratic change, achieve broad-based and equitable economic growth, and restore the rule of law, end of quote. Now, back to you, Mr. Mavinga. Has any of this been achieved?
It has been a difficult struggle because, as you are fully aware, ZANU-PF and the ZANU-PF government is very, very stubborn. But also to agree with Dr. Shannon Smith that the concept of economic sanctions on Zimbabwe is highly exaggerated. Really, in short, ZANU-PF inoyema apana zvaitwa as such. If you look at the relationship, you have got the Zimbabwe embassy flourishing in Washington D.C. and the U.S. ambassador there in Harare, and there are so much in terms of resources that the U.S. government is giving to Zimbabwe, directly to the people of Zimbabwe, in terms of programs around health, agriculture, HIV/AIDS. Small projects to support the people of Zimbabwe, and these are being ignored by a parochial ZANU-PF government that is trumpeting issues around the individuals who are identified primarily for being part of the inner circle of Mugabe or the cronies around Mugabe, and not a national or state sanction. So we need to be clear that the discourse of sanctions on Zimbabwe is one which is mainly about propaganda on the part of Zimbabwe and not about substance and reality. Having said that, ZANU-PF has been stubborn, so we might question whether or not these so-called smart sanctions have been effective, because ZANU-PF has not moved forward to carry out the necessary reforms, we have made major strides in terms of having a new constitution on paper, which has got progressive pronouncements on democracy, on elections, on human rights respect, and an expanded human rights bill. An established constitutional court, which has issued some very good and positive judgments recently. But that is not enough. As you are aware, we have not had a complete realignment of the existing laws with the new constitution. And as we speak, the people of Zimbabwe, as citizens, are not yet fully enjoying the benefits that derive from having a new constitution. So we are still, we have taken a few steps forward, but this current ZANU-PF government, as of July 2013, has taken strides backwards. And it's not clear where we are going for as long as there is no clear succession plan beyond Mugabe, who is 91 and who is, for all intents and purposes, should have retired, gone into the sunset to write his memoirs and other stories for grandchildren and things like that. This has not happened, and there is a fear and concern that in terms of the human rights environment, in terms of stability for the country, things could become very messy before they become better.
Thank you.
As people jump off the power.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Mavinga. I think we have our reporters at the Congress. I think they can just give us a quick update. I think we have Mr. Ntungamili. Mr. Kandemiri, actually. What's the latest now, Jonga?
The meeting is just started. I think in the first 10 minutes, the first speaker was the chair of the meeting, Mr. Smith, and he gave a brief background of Zimbabwe since the time that came to Zimbabwe through the SAP, and also the time that Zimbabwe gained independence, and how President Mugabe and his ruling party were welcomed by Zimbabweans who were being trembled upon by the white regime. And he went on to say that after that, things just started changing in Zimbabwe. He mentioned what he called was the hounding of opposition leader Jacob Zuma by President Mugabe. Then he was the Prime Minister of Zimbabwe. And the Kukura Windi era, where he mentioned that a lot of Zimbabweans were paralyzed during that period. And that supported the formation of the unity government in 1987. And he also touched on the current situation, economy and political issues, and also human rights issues. And later then came Ms. Shannon Smith, who visited the blog recently, and she also started giving an update. By the time I came out, she had mentioned the issue of Itai Samara and also the unemployment rate. So those are some that are being Shannon Smith is one of the witnesses who are lined up to speak at this meeting.
Thank you so much, Jonga, for that quick update.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Of course, the connection is not that good, but I think we could hear him. He's saying that the meeting, of course, they started in earnest, and they are talking about human rights issues. The disappearance of Itai Dzamara is one such prominent issue. Of course, also the state of the economy is another issue that they are discussing. Gibbs.
Yes, we baba ke khona ngapho sibanda ngamafitshane sibili sizwile lapha uJonga ekhuluma esithi umhlangano usuqalisile khona lapha eCongress ngakho bebesizwa ke uShannon Smith ekhuluma ngesimo akubonayo khona ngale Zimbabwe. Okunye kwangikhona ukukhuluma ngalokho ukuthi kulo baba lo kuthiwa uItai Dzamara owacatshayo khona ngale kule Zimbabwe kuzobuya lo mnotho ukuthi ungana uqhubeka kahle. So ke nxa usukhangeleke ngodaba lukaDzamara lolu ngamba isilo luyagcina lungani lwenze ukuthi iMelika ibambelele khonapho kuzijeziso lezi.
Indaba kaDzamara vele ngendlela abenze ngayo akade angithi ezinye izizathu zabo nezinto ababesithi bafuna zenzakale ukuthi kuphele ababekuthi bona i-lawlessness le-violence lokwethusela okuvele nje kubangelwa nguhulumende kumbe kusekelwa nguhulumende. So ukucatsha kalo jaha uDzamara sekusifaka njalo esigabeni sona lese kungathi akusabonakala ukuthi kanti umthetho welizwe uma njani umuntu angaphonga ukunyamalala nje kuthiwa aphonga ukuthathwa ngabantu afakwe emotweni kwaphelela khona lapho kungazakala ukuthi yinto ehambe njani eqale ngaphi. Izanikeza igunya kubona labo abavele bengafuni ukuthi kube lento etshintshayo ukuthi bebambelele kukho khona lokho bese besithi-ke kungabi lengqubekela phambili. Kodwa nxa sesikhangela vele ngezizathu zabo ababezibekile kulutshwana okungathi sekube yingqubekela phambili ukuthi kungathiwa izizathu zabo loba izizathu umuntu athi ziqondile kumbe ziqondanga, kodwa akukho okuningi okungathiwa sekutshintshile okungabangela ukuthi bethi hayi laphana sasibone ingathi kunje sesitshintshile ngoba sesibone sekulomehluko ohamba kanje.
So he's saying the disappearance of Itai Dzamara is actually putting Zimbabwe back into the spotlight. So he says it's a road where Zimbabwe was not supposed to go. So then he further said that almost nothing has been achieved under Zidera. So that's another problem there.
Mr. Mangwana, your take on this disappearance of Dzamara?
It's tragic indeed. We have spoken about this subject before, and we have said whenever a family man or any individual disappears or is killed for whatever reason, it's tragic indeed. So if Itai is alive wherever he is, and we hope he is, because there's no evidence otherwise, we just hope he comes back to his family and he continues his life. That's the position which basically the whole party and the whole country holds. That if the elements were involved in his disappearance should bring back Itai.
Thank you so much.
Ye ngizwa kuthiwa ke uNtungameli Nkomo khona ngale ekhongolose usekhona ecingweni la ku Skype. Baba Ntungameli Nkomo ukhona ecingweni baba?
Sekhona.
Yes, akusitshela ukuthi sokusenzakalani kathesi.
Usakhuluma lapha uDr. Shannon Smith njengokusho kwami ngaphambilini kuke wabuza ukubana kuyini esikuzwayo ngokuthi iMelika iza kuphatha njani udaba lobudlelwano phakathi kwayo leZimbabwe. Usangakhuluma lapho uDr. Shannon Smith uthi yebo kube seZimbabwe kumaviki amathathu edluleyo, kodwa akunalutho solutshintshile ubudlelwano phakathi kweZimbabwe leMelika buzaqhubeka njengoba buyibo ngendlela the way it is. Kathesi ngoba akunalutho osoluguqukile. Ukhulumeni njalo ngodaba lukaItai Dzamara, indaba zamalungelo oluntu. uItai Dzamara kaziwa lokho engaziwa ukuthi kungaphi, njalo ukhulumeni ukhanye engazimiselanga kakhulu ukumdinga etholakale kumbe kwaziwa ukuthi kuyini okwenzakalayo kuyo. Ukhulume njalo ngokuthi uMgabe at 91 kukhanya vela kula sayini ukuthi uzimisele ukuchiya isikhundla uqhubeka egogodlela embusweni. Uphethe njalo udaba lamabandla aphikisayo ukubana aqhubeka ehlefuka esiba izihlebo siyazokwenzakeleyo ku-MDC renewal namhlanje uMankoma selephansi.
Hayi siyakuzwa kakhulu ke sesizakuzwa mbamba sisakufonela futhi baba Nkomo sithi ukuthi uhamba njani.
Hayi kulungile.
Siyabonga Nkomo wakho. So what you're saying is, Dr. Shannon Smith was actually on the floor like what Tongo was saying. So he says she spoke about this issue on Itai Dzamara and indicated that the state is not actually willing in any way or showing any signs that they are looking for Mr. Dzamara. You still remember that there is a High Court edict or order which said they must look for him. And I think lastly, there are two other points. He says Dr. Smith actually mentioned again that Mr. Mugabe is 91 but is not showing any signs of leaving office. And then lastly, maybe he was, talking about the way the MDC has been fracturing. Says there are too many MDCs. Like today, we got another MDC. So we don't know whether it's another MDC or something else, So those are the facts, what Tuka was saying.
Yeah.
It's RDZ or something like that. Anyway.
Too many MDCs. I saw someone writing on Facebook that you'll be having MDC Mango for Mangomba.
No, he calls this a renewal Democrats of Zimbabwe or something like that.
Yes. RDZ. Mr. Mavinga, your take on what we are hearing from our reporters?
It makes quite sad hearing and reading, really. It's unfortunate that it might almost appear as if Zimbabwe is cursed, because you have, on one hand, a very stubborn, heartless, insensitive ruling party, ZANU-PF, that does not seem to care at all about the citizens, but only about power, the retention of power at all costs, using force, including in cases where we have the disappeared activist Itai Zamara, where there is no appetite or action on the part of the police to look for him, notwithstanding a high court order to that effect. And at the same time, to talk to it all in terms of our misery and despair as a people, you have a splintering and fracturing opposition, where almost on a monthly basis there is a new MDC that is formed. It's unfortunate. People should have learned to, maintain a focus and vision for greater national good, and put aside, egos, personal interests, and ambitions to say, how do we better serve Zimbabwe? But it appears everyone is after power and money, and no one really is saying, what are the interests of the people? How can we improve the livelihoods of Zimbabweans and stand together as a nation with the pride, where our people who are scattered across the globe, you can name any country, you are likely to find a Zimbabwean there trying to eke out a living because things are not well back at home. Mm-hmm. How can we all come back together and move forward as a nation with pride and say, we are Zimbabweans who are proud to be Zimbabweans because what we are doing in our country is positive. But at the moment, it's all like it's going down the drain. Our president is humiliated in Nigeria and is falling asleep there or in Sudan. It's tragic. It's all tragic, really.
Thank you very much. Now, 1 minute each. I'll start with you, Mr. Spanda. 1 minute, your last word, and then we go to Mr. Mangwana. Just 1 minute each.
Sure. My last word basically that I honestly don't see anything coming out of this discussion. And definitely one of the problems that our country is facing is that we've been subjected for too long to politics, and politics is messing us around too much.
Mr. Mangwana?
Our position is there is no justification for these sanctions against our country. It's hitting the vulnerable in our communities and our society. It's a blunt instrument. That's probably not cutting anyone on the elite because the elite do not have that particular money outside the country. So since there is no justification, we just hope this data would be repealed forthwith so that we can move on with our country.
And Mr. Mavinga?
Well, Zimbabweans, especially those across the board in ZANU-PF like Mangwana, let us be honest for once and not use propaganda when it's by stake. What is required now is for Zimbabwe and for the ZANU-PF government to take clear, concrete steps to reform and re-engage with the international community on the basis of change. It cannot be on the basis of the same old ZANU-PF regime that does not care about the rule of law or human rights respect or the value of the lives of Zimbabweans. We need a reformed ZANU-PF, a government that cares about the people, and a government that is clear, and a ZANU-PF that is clear about the future outside and after Mugabe. There must be life after Mugabe. There must be Zimbabwe after Mugabe. We cannot die with Mugabe, all of us.
Thank you, Mr. Mavinga. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, time is not on our side, but thank you so much, Mr. Dewa Mavinga, human rights lawyer, Mr. Sabelo Sibanda, Pan-Africanist, and Mr. David Monyai, independent political analyst, and also, last but not least, Mr. Nick Mangwana, ZANU-PF UK province chairperson. And we want to thank our reporters at Congress, and of course our team behind the scenes, engineers and producers, our viewers and listeners. This is Blessing Zulu.
And I'm Gibbs Dube saying good night. est-ce que c'est nous les imbéciles ou bien eux?
Non, c'est pas nous, il faut faire la part des choses, ce sont les politiciens. Parce que il y a un monde qui a dit,
Moi, pas droite là. Moi là, de mon côté vide.
Attendez la voix de l'Amérique à mettre depuis Washington.
Bonsoir mesdames, bonsoir mesdemoiselles, bonsoir.
Objectif là, c'est toujours...
L'objectif principal, c'est de publier.
Nous faisons programme Radio 5 après-midi.